All right, great. So I will be recording just in case. I'm going to have to record because our attendance is capped at 300, and we have about 387, maybe a couple of more students in the class. And so let me now do the screen share and jump in. Let's see here. Jump in. Now, for those of you interested, the social network, I have included the relevant film clip from the face mash incident. But the movie is available on Netflix. You may have to go into the search function. But this is the Netflix homepage where they talk about the movie and give you more details, and then other movies that are relevant. But I've included, what I'm going to do now is just go into the homepage. And by the way, while I introduce these introductory remarks, I have created here a survey specifically for this class to reward attendance here. And survey, it's 4 questions. And what I'll do is we'll look at the results toward the end of the class. So it's a graded survey. You'll get full credit for just answering, providing any response. But what I want to do is go into, and this is also will serve as sort of an instructional, so you'll see what we'll be doing the rest of the semester. You may have noticed that the first week of class, I took my foot off the gas. We needed a little time off, just a couple of very simple academic activities. And then now, what we're doing this week, it's what we'll be doing for the next 4 weeks. I'll be posting a module on Monday. Now, next Monday is a holiday, so I'll post the module on Tuesday. And then I'll give you until the end of the week. There'll be a couple of assignments. Next week, because it is a shorter week, I'll give you till Saturday. And then we'll be doing that for the next few weeks. And then at the very end of the semester, I'll assign a couple of weeks ahead of time. I'll assign a simple final project, which I'll discuss more in class number 4. But now what I want you to do, and the purpose of this screen share, is just to go into homepage here since we're virtual. And I'm going to be focusing on this first part of the module, and I'll be doing this, every week for all of the modules. You'll notice I have included examples of, I'm focusing on hacking in this class, computer crimes, because that's really a significant and serious problem. Probably the most significant criminal threat in the, business environment today. And so I've given you here some examples of a state cybercrime law, including not just the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, which is what we'll focus on, because that's where the face mash, occurred. There would be jurisdiction there, but also if you want a comparison, you can look at California cybercrime law, and then Florida has a cybercrime law as well. I've included some federal law, including a recent case that is actually pending. It should be decided before the end of summer A. So I'll talk about that in today's lecture. We'll look at federal computer crime law. And then also we'll look at international law. Believe it or not, there's an international convention, and the United States is a party. The United States has ratified this Budapest Convention that we'll talk about in today's class. And then if time permits, I also want to talk about something that's called natural law, which is a little bit of a, it's a unique area of law. It's kind of controversial. What is the relationship between law, positive law, and natural law, man-made law, and morality? But if time permits, I'll look at that at the end of the class. If time doesn't permit, I'll just extend. You're free to, to bail, but I'll say a few words about natural law and ethics towards the end. And then as you can see, here are the assignments along with the survey. I'll add the survey there after today's lecture. But let's go. What I want to show you here are some materials. Now, the first 2 materials are just your standard, chapter 1 of the textbook, just gives you a broad picture, legal foundations. And they talk about a lot of different sources of law. I'll be focusing on the main ones, but that'll give you a big picture. I've also included chapter 5, although you only need to read the first 3 pages of chapter 5, that just has a good summary of all the different theories of ethics. And but what I want to share with you now, there's a film clip here that if you just want to watch, I won't show it here for lack of time, but there is that's a link to the social network. the scene involving, Mark Zuckerberg. Now, I do want to say this about that scene, whether you've seen it or not seen it. And this is a very important detail to know, because there's some controversy as to how accurate the social network is in terms of the historical events and actual individuals that the movie is depicting. And one of the interesting things about the face mash scene is that the voiceover that Jesse Eisenberg is, when you watch those scenes, the dialogue there, or monologue, I should say, is word for word from Mark Zuckerberg's own blog, personal blog. It was the quote unquote Zucknet blog, as he called it back then. So, that's telling me, that part of at least the first part of the movie is, there's some historical accuracy, high level of historical accuracy there, in that, Jesse Eisenberg is just reading what Mr. Zuckerberg himself posted on his blog. But what I do want to share with you that's not in the movie, there may be a reference to the Harvard Crimson. So the Harvard Crimson is the student newspaper. I think UCF used to have a student newspaper, like a piece of paper, an old-fashioned newspaper. I think it was called Central Florida Future, if I'm not mistaken. And several years ago, it became defunct. Now there's like a website called Night News. But the Harvard Crimson is now completely online. Back in the day, it was just an old-fashioned newspaper. But the online version of this news article, which I'm about to show you, in fact, what I'm going to do here is, you can see here, if you scroll down, you'll have access to the article. It's not the same as the actual, reading the old newspaper, like they show in the social network. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on here and just open this up in a separate tab, so that I'm able to zoom in on this. And this was real, this happened at Harvard. And so this was a real big news. And one of the things you need to know about Face Mash and about Zuckerberg's exploits, hacking Harvard University. One of the things that's not obvious, that's a little bit unusual, you have to understand Harvard was created in, founded in 1636. So it's one of the oldest, second oldest university after William and Mary. In Williamsburg, Virginia. Harvard is a very old, famous university. And Harvard is divided into residential houses. So your very first year at Harvard, if you're lucky enough to be admitted into Harvard, you live in Harvard Yard as a freshman. You live in the middle of campus. But your sophomore year, and you're going to live your sophomore year, you're going to be assigned one of 12 residential houses. For example, Zuckerberg lived in the Kirkland house. And the thing about it is, you're going to live in this residential house, this dorm, if you will, for the next 3 years until you graduate. So this is an important fact for two reasons. One is sort of to go off topic. If you think about it, people at Harvard go on to, in many cases, to accomplish great things. I think one of the reasons people at Harvard, graduates of Harvard go on to accomplish great things is the fact that they, students will live in close proximity with each other for 3 years after their freshman year, and so you're going to establish a lot of contacts, because your residential house, it doesn't do it justice to call it a dorm. Your residential house has your dining hall, it'll have a gym, it will have, a rec room or student lounge. It's a big social center. We're going to be interacting with classmates for the next 3 years. So that's a really important thing. The other thing is, back in 2003, each residential house had its own website. And on its own website, each residential house had a quote unquote electronic Facebook. And that's what Zuckerberg, and by the way, those Facebooks that each residential house maintained, basically those, they were very primitive by today's standards. All that was is when you took your ID photo to get your Harvard ID as a student your freshman year, that ID photo, would go into a database at Harvard. And then, once you're assigned your residential house, that residential house would post your student ID photo, so that fellow classmates could, in your residential house could identify you. One of the problems with and the movie is very accurate about this. One of the problems with the system is, very primitive, it's not interactive, but by the same token, it was pretty advanced for its time. You could download, or you could access someone's picture by going into the website. But the problem is that each of these residential houses, or most of the 12, and by the way, each of the residential houses are completely autonomous. So they have their own rules, their own traditions. And one of the things is that they have their own websites. And most of these websites were password protected. So if you had a friend at Harvard, or somebody that you were interested in, maybe becoming friends with, or getting to know better, and they lived in a different residential house, you might not, most likely, you would not be able to access, their Facebook post. You know what I mean? Now, their Facebook picture. I can tell you, when I was at Yale before the internet, Yale was divided into residential colleges at the undergraduate level, very much like the houses at Harvard. And at the graduate level, there was the law school and the other graduate schools. And so each graduate school, for example, and each residential college, like Harvard, had its own, they printed out their own Facebook. My copy, I don't have it right now with me. It's in Los Angeles at my parents' house. So students, you might have access to basically it's kind of like a yearbook, but really, unlike a yearbook, it just had headshots, and you would get this Facebook at the beginning of the year. But by 2003, Harvard, other colleges, they had these primitive electronic versions. And here comes Mark Zuckerberg. And what's really interesting about this article is it really tells you all the things that are going on here. And it's written by a Barry Schwartz, and she is now a very well-known journalist. And many people students at the Harvard Crimson, you may have heard of Brian Williams, for example. He's a host of the 11th Hour at MSNBC. He was, before he had a whole scandal, he was the anchor man of NBC News. And so, he was on the Harvard Crimson, for example, back in the day. And so a lot of famous journalists got their start there. And what's really interesting about this article is how it talks about, a couple of Harvard students were in a beauty pageant, but over the weekend, everybody was being basically judged on their looks. And you see here, it describes the website. You see a little bit of Mark Zuckerberg's kind of sardonic sense of humor. Were we let in for our looks? No, right? We're let in for our SAT scores, most likely, right? And other factors. But will we be judged on our looks? So Zuckerberg is kind of making an interesting point here. So you have this website designed as the movie kind of depicts, recreating the face mash, the origins of face mash, and then what it's designed to do to rank, find out who the hottest student is. Now, one of the interesting things is, I should say, sort of in defense of Mark Zuckerberg, is that there is something called Hot or Not, and Face Smash is very similar to that. But what you have to understand, and this is sort of like if you want to sort of, as an attorney, law professor, I'm former defense attorney. I like to, take the difficult case and defend somebody, and I would, what's interesting about the face smash is that on the back end, that formula that Eduardo Saverin or Andrew Garfield is writing down on the dorm window. I don't know if that really happened, but that formula really is that algorithm, the chess ranking ELO algorithm, named after Professor Elo, a Hungarian physicist, who came with a way of ranking chess players. Like Magnus Carlsen has a ranking, it's almost 3,000. It's like one of the highest rankings of all time. And the thing about, by the way, the chess ranking algorithm is used by the U.S. Tennis Association. It's used by a lot of, organizations, sports groups that have to rank players. Like, how do we know Rafa Nadal, for example, is the #1 player and Djokovic is the #2 player, or vice versa? Well, what happens is when Rafa Nadal plays Djokovic and Nadal wins, he just played, another world champion, or vice versa. If Djokovic beats Nadal, or Magnus Carlsen, plays, or let me put it this way. if Magnus Carlsen were to play me, and Magnus Carlsen, 99.9, he's going to win that match, right? His ranking will go up, but maybe by 1 or 2 points, if that, because I'm not a ranked chess player, If I somehow pull off an upset, and I defeat Magnus Carlsen, the reigning world chess champion, my ranking is going to go up by several hundred points because I've just defeated the best player in the world. If, however, I play, let's say, one of my TAs, Ben Mayo, probably he's better than me, but neither of us are ranked, and Ben beats me. Again, his ranking is going to go up, but not very much because he's playing an unranked player. I'm not that good, unfortunately. So that's how basically that's how the Hot or Not website or the Face Smash worked. I mean, if you really care about who the hottest student at Harvard was, this was a much better algorithm than Hot or Not. Because Hot or Not, what you would do is you would take a picture and you would assign a ranking from 1 to 10, 10 being very, very hot, 5 being average, right? And 1 being basically ugly, terrible. But the problem with Hot or Not is that people are going to have different standards of beauty, right? So not everybody will agree on what an 8 is, for example, or what a 6, or even what a 10, And so Hot or Not, it gives you, it's not a bad system, it'll give you in the aggregate, the more people who are voting, it'll give you some good idea who that population of voters think is the hottest, a picture there. But if you really want to go for accuracy, you want to use the chess ranking algorithm. And the way Face Smash worked, you see in the movie, it's a great scene, is that you have to vote left or right. You have to what you think is the hottest picture. So what happens is a picture that keeps winning and keeps being selected as hot, when that picture goes up against another picture that's also won a bunch of rounds, right? The winner of those 2 hot pictures, quote unquote, that's going to get a whole bunch of points. Because now you're playing, because now now there's a consensus that these are 2 hot pictures, quote unquote. And so, it's one thing to beat a picture that's been ranked low, over time. It's another thing to pick a picture that's been ranked high, and so it's, it's fascinating stuff. Now, the only reason why I know all this stuff is because I'm a geek, and there's an area of law called social choice theory. Some of you that are economics majors may have heard of the public choice theory or social choice theory. There's a guy, Ken Arrow, he won a Nobel Prize for so-called Arrow's theorem and trying to look at voting systems logically. So it's a really fascinating topic. Obviously, that's more advanced, that's graduate level stuff. I just want to let you know that, if you want to play devil's advocate, if you really care who the hottest student at Harvard is, at any given time, probably the use of the chess ranking algorithm is going to be the best way to go. The problem, of course, is that, and you see here, there's a reference to Zuckerberg, a computer science concentrator. And you can see here that Barry Schwartz, notice there's no allegedly here. It's not allegedly hacking into the House online Facebooks. Zuckerberg is admitting to this on his blog. You know what I mean? So it's like, Barry Schwartz doesn't need to use the word allegedly here, And then here it explains how it goes viral and then the source of the controversy. And what's going to happen is this website is going to get, even though there's no iPhones back then, even though very few people have Blackberries that might have the capacity, even BlackBerry, all you do is basically access your email, back in 2003. So what happened is people are basically forwarding this to other people via email. Apparently, Mark Zuckerberg, sent this to maybe 4 people, and then they sent it to a few other people, and then it just kind of spiraled out of control. And what ended up happening is a number of student groups, such as the Institute of Politics, the Fuerza Latina student group, and the ABHW, Association of Black Harvard Women. All these, members of these organizations, received the link, and then they realize what's going on. And there's going to be some outrage, and this is going to make it to the front page of the Harvard Crimson, Here you have what's really remarkable, without Twitter, without Facebook, without social media, the website, 450 people in a few hours, basically were on the website voting 22,000 times, so it's like in the movie, this is sort of where the idea for Facebook allegedly pops up into Zuckerberg's mind, Jesse Eisenberg, right? There's a great dialogue in that movie where Jesse Eisenberg tells Andrew Garfield, hey, there's pictures of hot girls all over the internet. That's not why people visited the site. People visited the site because these were classmates. These were quote unquote girls that the people knew, people who were on FaceMash knew, right? There was something fascinating, and that's something that's not in the article. Zuckerberg, it turns out, is a double major at the time, and his other concentration is psychology. And so, I think that part of the movie is also accurate. That there was something about that. Why did FaceMash go viral in an environment where the word viral didn't even exist yet? And so, at least in the context we use it today. Now, what's really interesting about the article, I won't go into the entire article. I really recommend the article. It's fascinating. It gives you it's why I started with the music from 2003. It takes us back in time. Kevin Davis is going to be interviewed as well. He's the director of residential computing, right? He's going to explain what it is, why it is that what Zuckerberg did was possibly illegal. That's what we'll talk about in this course. And then you're going to have a bunch of Zuckerberg's own blog posts are going to be quoted in the article, including the fateful 4 words, "Let the hacking begin," at 12:58 a.m. But here, what I want to call your attention to in this article is Leila Bravo. She is the president of the Fuerza Latina student group. And what's really interesting is that she's the only one to publicly go on the record and say that this was wrong. If you think about it today, for example, 60 Minutes, 2 Sundays ago, the opening segment before they did the UFOs was about artificial intelligence and facial recognition, and how if you're a person of color, the AI algorithms are not fair. And a lot of innocent Black men have been, arrested and sent to jail, until they could, the courts could clear up. So, what's really interesting is that as early as 2003, you can see here, it's the ABHW, it's Leila Bravo, right? Calling the injustice of what's going on here, in many ways, foreshadowing the future. But what I want to do is, we could come back to the morality of this whole thing. But what I want to do now is end the screen share. Oh, there's one thing I do want to show you is, let me do one more screen share because it's a short film clip. But many years later, back in 2018, many of you may have heard of Cambridge Analytica. This is when, and again, excuse me, I'm going to be vulgar here, but I want to capture everybody's attention. This is when the shit finally hit the fan for Facebook and Zuckerberg, the Cambridge Analytica data scandal. Although Facebook itself allegedly didn't do anything wrong, right? Cambridge Analytica used user private Facebook data in order to sell ads to potential voters in the Brexit referendum of June 2016 and potential, voters of the 2016 presidential election between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. And so there was a whole outcry. In November of 2017 is when the New York Times broke the story, that a lot of Facebook user data was being used without user consent, being sold to third parties. And these third parties were basically these sophisticated polling companies, some based in London, others based in, the United States, that were then, using that data to sell targeted ads during the Brexit referendum, which arguably changed the course of European history. The United Kingdom is no longer part of the European Union, and of course the 2016 presidential election. Now, we're going to have a debate, how effective these ads were the outcome of Brexit referendum and 2016 presidential election. Were they really, altered? because of these targeted ads. I myself am personally a little bit skeptical, but you have to understand that these elections were very close and changed the course of history. And even if they had no effect on the outcome, a lot of people, kind of like Leila Bravo and the ABHW, a lot of people thought it was wrong, that Facebook didn't take better steps to protect its data and to prevent that, from trying to be manipulated, in these very hotly contested political contests. So Zuckerberg had to go testify finally, April 2018, first week of April, to testify before Congress to explain how the Cambridge Analytica data breach occurred and what steps Facebook was going to take to prevent this from occurring again. But what I want to show you is one of the congressmen, Billy Long, who actually asked Mr. Zuckerberg, the only guy to ask Mr. Zuckerberg about face mesh. So I want to show you that exchange. I have it there short, so I kind of want to show it to you, you can decide for yourself. All right, hold on here. Let me go back to the module. Then after I show you this, we'll go into the lecture proper. Let me go back into the module here. And I'll do one more screen share. And I think it's really interesting because I want you to see, it's one thing to see Jesse Eisenberg read from Mr. Zuckerberg's blog post, the posts peppered with, dialogue of that is part of the movie, but here's Mr. Zuckerberg in his own words. Now, I do want to say one more thing. Billy Long, the congressman who asked this question, comes from a long and distinguished political family. His grandfather, Huey Long, was once the governor of Louisiana. And I should say that he was very populist. He was kind of like the Donald Trump of the 1930s. He had aspirations to run for president. He was actually assassinated in cold blood back in the day. His son, Russell Long, Billy Long's father, was the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee for like almost 40 years, spanning from 1960s all the way to the late 80s, early 90s. And all tax and spending bills have to be approved by the Senate Finance Committee. That's why a lot of people would say that Russell Long, Senator Long, was the most powerful man in Washington, during those decades when he was the chairman of that powerful committee. But here's his son, Billy Long. And he's quite a character, and you can check it out for yourself. So let's go ahead and do the screen share now. And let me go into the modules. And it's right in here. If you get this message, just click up onto here. It's one of the reasons why I wanted to do this as well. And it'll take a couple seconds for this to open up, but I think this is going to be worth our time. Oh, what happened? Oh, here it is. There's Billy Long. And let me see what happened to our sound. All right.
What was Face Smash, and is it still up and running?
No, Congressman. Face Smash was a prank website that I launched in college in my dorm room before I started Facebook. There was a movie about this, or it said it was about this. It was of unclear truth. And the claim that Face Smash was somehow connected to the development of Facebook, it isn't. It wasn't.
Just coincidental. The timing was the same, right? Just coincidental.
It was in 2003.
Okay,
and I
this
took
was
it down.
how you would
And
rate
it
women.
actually has nothing to do with
You put up pictures of two women and decide which one was the better, more attractive of the two. Is that right?
Congressman, that is an accurate description of the prank website that I made when I was
Okay.
a sophomore.
Okay. But from that beginning, whether it was actually the beginning of Facebook or not, you've come a long way.
Okay, I can't help to laugh, when Zuckerberg is saying that this has nothing to do with Facebook. But then again, each person is a judge of the accuracy of the social network. And be that as it may, we do have Face Smash. And so then let's go into our presentation today, and let's look at sources of law and, if time permits, the main theories of ethics. Specifically, was Face Smash illegal? And how do we decide that? how do we decide that when hacking is a crime? And secondly, even if conduct does not rise to the level of a criminal offense, how do we decide when something is right or wrong? So as you can see, those are important questions. That's why I like to begin the class with this big picture. So let me go ahead and to make this lecture a little bit more interesting, what I'm going to do is, and you can just disregard that. Let me just go into here. Let me just go into expand this here. All right. I've made a presentation here to make it a little bit more entertaining. So, so it's not just me talking, and let me go to the arrow here. And what I want to do is, here is, and we'll look at the survey results in a moment, but I submit to you that there's different ways that we could really describe face mash. We could go to the bottom, we do what Zuckerberg is trying to do. Oh yeah, this was just a harmless prank, sorry, you know what I mean? Sorry, not sorry. Of course, it's, Zuckerberg himself is kind of, I don't know how much credibility you want to give him as a potential juror, because obviously Mark Zuckerberg, he's got to say that, right? Because, what he did was, if he did that today, if somebody were to do that today with the Me Too movement and all the sensitivity out there, that would probably merit an automatic. I mean, that wouldn't even be a close call, but, that's one way of looking at it, a harmless prank. The other way of looking at it is maybe we can say that, no, this was morally wrong. This is a moral lapse, even though maybe it's not, we don't want to get the law involved here, but, we can at least look at the morality of this, that this was not just a harmless prank. This was an immoral conduct, now legally though, we could, and this is the main point I want to make here. This is the key thing you have to, this is like a DJ Khaled major key. We want to distinguish between civil and criminal liability. So I'm gonna in this class today, I'm gonna make the case that what Mr. Zuckerberg did was illegal, and in fact, it was a crime. And I'm going to try to persuade the class that in fact face mash was illegal, was a crime. In our next class, when we look at the common law really establishes the basic rules for civil liability. When something is just a civil wrong that doesn't merit criminal punishment, but where you do have to pay monetary damages. But we'll do that in the next class, because that's, let's break it up and so we can simplify this, So let's focus on the criminal aspects of face mash. I think also that's more interesting. And then next class we'll do the civil side, face mash as a potential civil wrong. Now, before I even begin, I want to say something that's really interesting. In my notes for this slide, I call this a fun fact. If you were to go, look up Facebook's corporate headquarters, although now they have a second headquarters, they opened up at what they call West Campus, but the original Facebook corporate headquarters, where Mark Zuckerberg has his offices, it's one hacker way. That's the address, to this day. And the thing about it is that, in other words, what's really interesting, this looks like, instead of a thumbs up, this should be like a big middle finger, right? This is Mark Zuckerberg saying, yeah, I'm a hacker and I'm proud of it, and that's what face mash was all about. And, I don't care, now I will say in defense, in the computer science community and among, computer programmers and people in that world, the term hacking is not necessarily a negative term. There is something called, for example, white hat hackers, people who, let's say, hack but don't have a criminal intent. A white hat hacker, for example, a lot of companies, I think Facebook itself actually has what they call a bounty policy. If you can find a bug or a flaw in Facebook source codes, then you will get, you are potentially eligible for a reward if you bring that to the proper channels and bring that to the attention of Facebook. I think if you go on the Facebook website, there's actually one of the links is the bounty program. And a lot of other companies do that. I think Google does that as well, et cetera. And so those are the white hat hackers, that they don't consider themselves morally wrong. In fact, they're hacking for good purposes to try to identify the weaknesses before the bad guys do, so that the companies can fix the weaknesses and I can get paid. Then there's something called the black hat hackers, and in the cowboy movies, whoever's wearing a black hat is supposed to be the villain, the bad guy. So black hat hackers, those are the guys in Russia or in Central Europe, in some basement somewhere that are hacking companies for ransom. That's the oil pipeline hack, the Colonial Pipeline that was a couple of weeks ago. I'm going to hack you, and you don't pay me $5 million in Bitcoin, I'm going to shut down your pipeline, and paralyze all commercial aviation and transportation in the East Coast, all the way from Texas up to the Northeast. So those are your black hat hackers. And then in between you have gray hat, where sometimes it's a gray area. Is this a good guy or a bad guy? But what's interesting is that, and by the way, I'm only going to throw this out here. I'm not going to go into that much detail because this will be more for an advanced course. Once we're in the domain of so-called black hat hackers, people who are, clearly breaking the law, there's all kinds of different ways of hacking and different types of illegal hackers, And so this is sort of like one way of looking at it. We could try to have a taxonomy. These are the 5 types of cyber criminal hackers. What's really interesting is that Zuckerberg seems to be here the paradigm case, right? He's not a ransom artist. He's not asking Harvard for money for him to shut down the website, right? He's not doing that. He's a student. You can say he's a rogue student, but he's not an employee of Harvard. So it doesn't really fall into that category either. Spear Fisher, these are the scams you get over the internet. You may have gotten scammed yourself. Like somebody wants to pay you $500 to do a dog sitting or a pet sitting scam, you may have gotten that email a couple of weeks ago. That's the so-called Spear Fisher. Social engineer. This is a sort of a broad label. These are like the North Koreans, basically hacking and trying to Sony movie studios, not because they want money or anything like that, but just because they want to embarrass, Sony, But then you have the hacker right here in the middle. This is your classic old-fashioned hacker. Notice he's wearing the black. It actually is a gray hat, but but again, is it a white hat or is it a black hat? One of the things I want to tell you, one of the interesting things about cyber crime is that if you look at hacking from a legal perspective, the law makes no distinction between white and black hacks. It basically hacking is hacking. Now we'll see at the end of the lecture, the prosecutors generally, have discretion not to bring charges against white hat hackers, especially if nobody wants to press charges. That's going to kind of be the Zuckerberg case. But let's take a look at the law. Let's look at, I've done this big introduction, and by the way, I want to do this big introduction because face mash, it does look like to some extent a college prank, or if you want to go, what Leila Bravo is saying, an outrageous thing, but localized to the Harvard community. You know what I'm saying? But what I want to emphasize is that the face mash is emblematic of all these companies that have been hacked. It's not just Harvard, right? The Colonial Pipeline, big companies like Home Depot, Target, Florida Hospital, now they're Advent Hospital, UCF has been, student data has been hacked, and who knows, I know years ago, I got an email back in I think it was 2014, about this, and who knows if UCF has been hacked since then, right? But so this is a real big problem. And of course, there's even some allegations that they're hacking about elections, you know what I mean? Although I noticed I won't say anything, but there's some concern that the elections results may not be safe, that they are vulnerable to hacks. So what is the law of hacking? Well, first of all, I want to show you a spider web, and I want to show you a portrait of an English legal historian, F.W. Maitland. No relation to the Maitland who founded the city of Maitland by Winter Park. But F.W. Maitland, the English or British legal historian, he has what I consider one of the most beautiful phrases to describe the law. In one of his history, scholarly works of legal history, he describes the law, and I now quote, as a seamless web. And that's why I have the spider web here. You know, if you ever have the, opportunity, to really observe a spider web, you're going to notice it's a really beautiful creation, and every part is connected to every other part. What's really cool about Maitland's description, we're talking about 1800 something, there was no internet, right? The internet pretty much works like this. Every part is connected to every other part, but what Maitland is saying is that the law itself is a seamless web. Now, the reason why I begin with this famous description, it's not in the textbook, but it's really something you should know, that when we talk about the law, quote unquote, it is a very, and I say this sort of like by way of introduction, it's a very complicated and kind of messy, because it's organic, and it has many different parts, and all of these parts have various interconnections. So what I want to do is, beginning with the fact that the law is a seamless web, that it's messy, complicated, interconnected. Let's see if we can simplify it. Let's see if we can, paint. Let's see if we can tame the spider web or try to figure out the logic of the legal web. And so, what I want to do is now we're focusing here on our legal environment in the United States. So I definitely have here a major key symbol, because one way of simplifying the law is by saying, okay, what are the main sources of law? Where does the law come from? And when you do it that way, you're going to say, basically, there's three big sources of law. I have them there listed there in the left bottom corner, right? State and local law, federal law, and then international law. And what we'll do today is we'll take a look at each one of these three areas of law in the context of cyber crime, in the context of illegal hacking of computer and computer networks. Now, before I do that, though, I do want to just give some, because we have to combine a lot into summary. I want to give you just a little bit of background into each of these areas of law, where they're similar and where they're different. They're similar in that they all purport to provide rules of conduct, and the geographic scope of those rules of conduct may or may not overlap. You know what I mean? But what I want to focus on, when we talk about state and local law, states under our constitutional system, states have what the courts call a general police power to protect the health, safety, and welfare of its citizens and residents. Now, this is very, very important, because think of mask mandates. Notice at the federal level, there's only a mask mandate for interstate transportation. And the reason why there's not a federal mask mandate, even though, I'm sure Dr. Fauci would love to make everybody wear masks, but the reason why there's not a federal mask mandate is because the federal government does not have that general police power that the states have. So some states, so-called blue states like California, they've enacted very strict, statewide mask mandates under their general police powers. Other states like Florida have said, okay, we're going to use our police power to allow each municipality or each county to decide for itself whether it wants to have a mask mandate. And of course, that now has been, I think, completely abrogated. Texas went further, and Texas was the first state, right, to say, okay, we're getting rid of the statewide mask mandate, but we'll allow private businesses to have whatever rules they want. So, the police power is very, very important, because whenever you have a question, can the government do this? You have to ask yourself, is it the state government I'm talking about, or the federal government? If it's the state government, the state, yes, the state does have, within its borders, does have a general police power to protect health, safety, and welfare. So states have very, very broad powers. Under the police power. Now, the common law is another important area of state law. We're going to talk about the common law in the next class, because it's so important and so special, and it provides the basic rules for civil liability, civil wrongs. That we'll talk about that in the next class. I won't say anything more about that. Now, federal law, the important thing to know about federal law is that, technically speaking, federal powers are supposed to be delegated and limited, enumerated powers. I'll give you the best example, Article 1, Section 8 of the United States Constitution. identifies the powers that Congress has, and the thing about the federal power is that if that power is not in Article 1, Section 8, Congress does not have the power to legislate, even if, or the president either, by executive order. It's got to be an enumerated power before the federal government can enact a law. Now, there's sort of like an important escape clause. One of the enumerated powers that Congress has in Article 1, Section 8 happens to be the most important one, not just for business and business law, but for constitutional law generally. Congress has the power to regulate interstate commerce, commerce with the Indian tribes, and commerce with foreign nations. I'm quoting now Article 1, Section 8. And so I think it's clause 6, if I'm not mistaken. The point is that shorthand, we just say, lawyers like to say, Congress has the power to regulate interstate commerce. And under Supreme Court jurisprudence, I'm not going to assign it, but under Supreme Court jurisprudence, even activity, as long as it's commercial in nature, even if it's just purely local and doesn't spill over to state lines, but if that local activity, if it's commercial in nature, and if in the aggregate could have spillover effects, Congress can regulate that too. So Congress's power to regulate commerce, interstate commerce, and any commercial activity, if you think about it, almost every activity we're engaged in has some commercial applications. I would even argue, if I wanted to defend Fauci and defend a mask mandate at the national level, I would argue to the extent the mask is about protecting health, and to the extent that protecting health helps commerce, I could make an argument to the court, that if anybody wants to challenge a federal mask mandate, that a mask mandate enacted pursuant to Congress's power to regulate commerce might be able to pass judicial scrutiny. That's a little bit of a stretch, because I have to make a two-step argument. But most activity, if it directly affects commerce, commercial in nature, then the Congress has the power to regulate. I do want to say a footnote. There's a famous case called United States versus Lopez. And in this case, who was Lopez? Well, you have to understand that back in 1996, when President Bill Clinton was running for re-election, the Congress enacted by a very broad bipartisan majorities something called the Gun-Free School Zones Act. And this was a very popular law at the time because it was basically made it a federal crime to bring a gun into a public school, into any school or any institution of higher learning, and within a certain I think 100-foot radius or something like that. So Lopez, he was a senior at a high school in Texas, and he brought a gun in, and he was prosecuted under this federal law. And his lawyer argued that the law was unconstitutional because bringing a gun to school doesn't really, that's not a commercial activity, it's not a business activity. This case went up to the Supreme Court, and by a very narrow 5-4 margin, I think this was in 98, the Supreme Court struck down the law as unconstitutional. And what's really interesting that they don't teach you in a lot of the textbooks is that the very next day, Congress reenacted the Gun-Free School Zones Act with the very same language, but adding a sentence saying that in the opinion of Congress, bringing a gun to school does affect commerce, because if you affect education in a negative way, you're affecting commerce in a negative way. So that law technically is still on the books, Now, whether prosecutors are going to actually bring charges under federal law, there's some discretion there. But that's very, very interesting because it goes to show you that the power of the Supreme Court is actually very, very limited. If Congress wants to do something, if Congress believes something affects commerce, generally the Supreme Court will go along with that. But that's a very, very important power, in other words. Finally, there's international law, which I will talk about in a moment. International law is really, really interesting, but I'll talk about that at the very end. All right, let's go back to cybercrime. Here's what I want to do. I want to make the case that Zuckerberg broke the law when he created FaceMash. I want to make the case that he broke state, federal, and possibly international law as well. Now, so let's look at the relevant law. Now, in Module A, I've included, cybercrime law from 3 important leading states: California, Florida, our state, home state, and the Commonwealth of state of Massachusetts, which is where all this stuff occurred. What's really interesting, though, if you look at state law, or Massachusetts law, I could argue here, looking at this from a lawyer point of view, and I don't want you to memorize this, I just want to give you an example of what a state law would look like, and to show you why the law is a seamless web and can be complicated, because you have 50 state cybercrime laws. And if you look at the California law and the Florida law, for example, you're going to see they look a lot different from this law in Massachusetts. But let's focus on this law because that's where Face Smash, occurred. And one of the interesting things is, although arguably, if any of the students there were like from Florida or from California, one could argue that maybe those state courts have jurisdiction, but that would be a more advanced topic, internet jurisdiction. But here, let's just focus on what's not controversial is the local law here. And one of the interesting things is if you look at this law, you could make a really strong, and this is why you always need legal representation. You could make actually a very strong argument that although Mr. Zuckerberg admits to hacking, I think 9 of the 12 residential college houses at Harvard and downloading these photos illegally, without authorization, or in violation of Harvard's own rules, guidelines, and stuff like that, student handbook. But under state law, you have to have an intent to defraud. I've underlined the really relevant language here. You have to have an intent, mental intent to defraud, and to obtain a commercial computer service. And later, at the bottom of that law, commercial computer service is defined as monetary gain or monetary consideration. One of the problems here is that when Zuckerberg launched Face Smash, right, it was completely for free, right? He's not really doing it to make money. He's a hacker in the original sense of the word, where he's just there to, to show how smart he is, and to build a website that people want to use, even if it has immoral implications, but there's no monetary gain here, right? There's no monetary consideration. There's no intent. I mean, is there a real intent to defraud Harvard? I mean, that's going to be a real hard case to bring under state law, as it existed back in 2003. I wouldn't be surprised that now that is, 18 years later or whatever, almost 18 years later, I wouldn't be surprised if this law has been subsequently revised and amended to maybe make it easier to prosecute cyber criminals in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, the state of Massachusetts. But back in 2003, right, I think Zuckerberg can get off on a technicality if state charges were to be brought, because, while you could argue that Harvard's database is a commercial computer service, because Harvard is a for-profit institution, right? But it's a private corporation. By the way, Harvard is the oldest corporation in the United States. But Harvard, although it's a private corporation, they're not really in it to make money, right? Their mission is to educate people, educate their students and disseminate knowledge through their faculty, And even if you could argue that Harvard is about money because they have a huge endowment and they do charge tuition and this and that. But the problem is, it's not Harvard, it's Zuckerberg. Did he have the intent to defraud? Did he have any monetary gain from building Face Smash aside from, getting all the attention and negative publicity that he got from the Harvard Crimson? Those are, I want to go into all this just to show you how lawyers think and why I loved going to law school and why, it's not so obvious. Although, what Zuckerberg did was wrong and arguably illegal. Technically speaking, state law, I think Zuckerberg could pretty much beat the rap, the state charges. But here's the deal. If you go back to our United States map, remember there's 3 big sources of law. And the other source of law is federal law and national law. Laws enacted by Congress and executive orders signed by the president. And guess what? There's something called the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act that was enacted in 1986. And that was subsequently amended to expand its scope. The original purpose of the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act was to protect something called the ARPANET. The ARPANET was basically the original internet that linked the Pentagon, the computers at the Pentagon, with computers at various universities that had military contracts. So MIT laboratories in Cambridge next to Harvard, that was part of the ARPANET. The Livermore labs at Berkeley out in Northern California, that was part of the ARPANET. Los Alamos lab in Santa Fe, New Mexico, that was part of the ARPANET. But then as the internet became commercial, you had AOL, and then you had, Microsoft Internet Explorer, Netscape, as in Google. Then the law was amended to protect all computers and interstate commerce, right? And notice the federal law. Check this out. It defines hacking very broadly. There's no language here about intent to defraud. There's no language here about monetary gain. There's no language of that limiting language. The federal law defines hacking as using a computer without authorization or in excess of authorization. This is why I can tell you in good faith, when I wear my lawyer hat or my law professor hat, I could make a very strong, legitimate case that Mark Zuckerberg is a criminal. When Zuckerberg launched the face mash, he was basically breaking this federal law. Now, he wasn't charged. We'll get to that later. He basically got lucky. You know what I mean? But if you look at the law, the way it's drafted, and you look at what Mark Zuckerberg did with face mash, which was basically downloading student ID photos without authorization or in excess of his student authorization that he had, to access those websites, those house websites, Harvard house websites. A very strong argument can be made that Zuckerberg broke federal law. He was in violation of federal law. And by the way, I want to tell you it's something really interesting. So I'm calling a timeout here. Back on November 30th of 2020, there was a case that was argued in front of the United States Supreme Court. I've included, if you want to check it out, the transcript of the oral argument. I've also included a SCOTUS blog, like a little one-page summary of the oral arguments. This case is still pending. It probably will be decided, by Supreme Court tradition, unless they authorize a re-argument, which is very rare. This case should be decided next month. I'm surprised it hasn't been decided yet. But it goes to show you how controversial the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act is. Because this case involved, who was Van Buren? And why was he being prosecuted for a federal crime under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act? Well, Mr. Van Buren was a member of the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, which is the Georgia statewide police. And the thing about Van Buren is he had authorization to access the GBI, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, or Georgia Police computers, right? To look at people, criminal records and mugshots and stuff like that. But Van Buren had a friend who he didn't know was a federal informant, an informant for the FBI. And his friend, kind of like to set Van Buren up, his friend said, "Here, I'm going to give you there's this young lady that I'm really interested in. She was an exotic dancer somewhere in Atlanta. And, here, I'm going to give you $4,000 if you could just give me information about, from her file, her police file. Has she ever been convicted of a crime? What's her address? This kind of stuff." And Van Buren, he did that. And so he was prosecuted under the Federal Computer Fraud and Abuse Act for, although he had authorization to access the Georgia police computer database, when he was accepting this bribe from this informant, he was acting in excess of authorization because the lady friend, the exotic dancer, she didn't, she was not under a criminal investigation, So this was an abuse of his police power. So the lawyer for the defense argued, but wait a minute, as a Georgia Bureau of Investigation policeman, right, he does have access to the computer. So maybe the bribe is illegal, but not using the computer. He didn't really go without authorization because he is authorized to use the computer, even if this was not an authorized use. And guess what? The Supreme Court, this was back in November, they argued the case. They still haven't decided it. So there must be a lot of arguments, a lot of back and forth, among the justices of the Supreme Court. What does it mean to use a computer without authorization? Now, this is going to have very important consequences, because If the Supreme Court decides that Van Buren is in fact guilty of a computer, of using a computer in excess of authorization, it's not a stretch to make the argument that if you use someone's Netflix password, for example, without authorization, or you guess someone's Facebook password to get into their, look at their pictures and stuff like that, one could argue that that's also a federal crime. So I have a feeling that the justices are very much concerned about, how to define what does it mean without authorization. Really, this is a very, I took this time out because this is actually a very important case. And this is why big business companies like Facebook, I'll show you later their board of directors. We don't have time in today's class. But for example, one of my classmates, Jennifer Newstead, you can look it up on Facebook's corporate governance page. I shouldn't say this because this is recording, but and I'm married now. I had a crush on her back when I was at Yale. But she is now the general counsel of Facebook. And that's why Facebook pays her a lot of money so that she can stay up to date, her and her team, on all of the stuff that's going on with Facebook. All the possible laws that could affect Facebook and their legal, criminal, and civil liability. And as you can see, right, because the Supreme Court and state Supreme Courts and state and federal courts generally play such an important role, as we'll see in the common law unit next class, this is why the big companies have their own general counsel, All right. Lastly, I want to talk about international law. And I'm not going to go into all the details of the Budapest Convention. Suffice it to say that the Budapest Convention, what it's designed to do is to make it easy to extradite cyber criminals from one country to another. By the way, the United States ratified this treaty back when I think George W. Bush was still president. So the United States is a member of this convention, of this treaty. So the idea here is that if Zuckerberg, if he had gone to, maybe another country, Romania, you know what I mean? And then try to hide out from the feds or whatever. If Romania is a member country, and it is, by the way, then Romania, there'll be a legal authority to extradite Mr. Zuckerberg for any cyber crimes that he might face in the United States. So it's just a way of facilitating international, criminal prosecutions here in different countries. Now, one of the interesting things of the International Budapest Convention, I wanted to two interesting things, one specific to the convention and one general to all international law. The specific thing that's really interesting about the Budapest Convention, because it was negotiated originally by the members of the European Union in Hungary and Budapest, the capital of Hungary, it makes it a cyber crime to disseminate hate speech. And so, and thus triggering all the extradition provisions. Under, however, US First Amendment law, hate speech, unless it's accompanied by an imminent threat of physical violence, hate speech is, technically speaking, you get fired for it, you get canceled for it, you could get shamed for it, but hate speech is, technically speaking, constitutionally protected under the First Amendment. Now, there's this great leading case called Brandenburg v. Ohio that establishes the principle. I will tell you, Brandenburg v. Ohio was decided in 1969. Probably if this case were to come up today, I wouldn't be surprised if the Supreme Court, if they were to withdraw First Amendment protection for hate speech, but under existing domestic US constitutional law as interpreted by the Supreme Court, it's okay if the states and the feds want to make a hate crime an aggravated offense, what I'm saying? But hate speech by itself cannot be a crime under existing US First Amendment law. And this is something a lot of people don't realize because, like if you're on Facebook, you're not allowed to post hate speech. They have their own content moderation policies, but under US, constitutional law, you can't be punished criminally for disseminating hate speech. So, I will tell you that this is an interesting conflict between the Budapest Convention and American domestic constitutional law that probably one day the Supreme Court will have to decide, right? What happens if a country in the European Union that's a member of the Budapest Convention wants to extradite somebody in the United States for hate speech? That's technically protected under US, First Amendment jurisprudence. That will be an interesting conflict, The other interesting thing about international law that I do want to bring to your attention that is not obvious unless I tell you, is that international law, it's a purely voluntary system. Had the United States not ratified the Budapest Convention, that means we wouldn't be a member of this treaty, and these provisions wouldn't apply to us. So every country gets to decide for itself when and if to join a treaty. Some treaties, like the Geneva Convention on War Crimes, right? A lot of countries are members of the Geneva Convention, right? Other treaties like the Budapest Convention also have a lot of members, but Russia, for example, and the People's Republic of China are not members of the Budapest Convention. So that's an interesting fact I want to bring to your attention. So it's unlike, domestic law. You basically, once the Congress enacts a federal law and it's upheld in court if challenged, or once the state government enacts a law under its police power and it's upheld in court if challenged, you have no choice but to obey the law, right? With international law, each country gets to decide for itself whether to ratify the treaty, based on its own constitutional provision. So in our country, the Senate would have to ratify the treaty, and then both the House and the Senate would have to enact enabling legislation to actually implement the treaty in this country. So it's actually very complicated. I see this argument all the time, like, what about human rights? Well, okay, fine. Human rights are very important, but has the United States ratified the human rights treaty that you think applies to a given situation? And if the United States has ratified that, the Senate has ratified the treaty, has the Congress as a whole enacted enabling legislation? So international law, it's very, it's a very cumbersome to actually make international law part of our legal system. But in the case of the Budapest Convention, it is. Cybercrime is so important that we have joined in the United States, we have joined the Budapest Convention on cybercrime. All right. So let me begin to wind down on this, and that is, if you think about it, a lot of different people could potentially bring charges or bring a case against Mr. Zuckerberg. I would really think the feds have the strongest case. You know what I mean? Because you saw for yourself, I showed it to you, Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, even putting aside the Van Buren case, using a computer without authorization is a federal crime. And Zuckerberg, arguably, by his own admission on his blog, used the Harvard database, accessed it without any authorization. The local DA, we saw there, that case is actually weak under local state law, because state law requires an intent to defraud and monetary gain. And probably when Zuckerberg, he's a hacker, right? He's building Face Smash for free. He doesn't really want money. He just wants to be, he's just a jerk, but he doesn't really want the money. So probably he gets off on state charges. In the next class, we'll actually see that Harvard, and I have a picture of Leila Bravo, who lives in South Florida today. They probably could have brought, in fact, Harvard does bring an administrative ad board proceeding against Mr. Zuckerberg. And although nobody sued Mr. Zuckerberg, none of his fellow classmates, but think about the kind of people that go to Harvard, right? Like Malaya Obama, right? Obama's daughter, President Obama's daughter, Michelle Obama's daughter, she goes to Harvard right now, right? So it's like, imagine, if somebody like that, their pictures posted on Facebook, obviously the Obama family, they have the money to bring a case, you know what I mean? If they had wanted to, but that's a common law, civil liability. We'll do that in the next class. What I want to end on here, though, is, well, so why didn't anybody bring criminal charges against Zuckerberg, right? Why didn't the feds bring their case? We saw why the local DA didn't do it. Their case is weaker based on state law. But one important principle that I want to end off on here is the so-called principle of prosecutorial discretion. It's a really important, it's a very fundamental, it's not in any book or anything, but it's just the way the system works. That the district attorney at the state level, local level, or the state attorney in Florida, or the federal prosecutor, the United States district attorney for the relevant district, they have ultimate discretion when and if to bring charges. And so this is a really important, so there are a whole host of factors, and the reason why this is important is because we have to understand that, probably the district attorney or the federal U.S. attorney for that district, they're probably dealing with some big time criminals. You know what I mean? Here you have Mark Zuckerberg. He's a sophomore, at Harvard. He did shut down the website. Actually, he didn't shut down the website. Harvard shut it down but it got shut down, rather quickly. And he took it down after that. So you look at all of these factors, that come into play. But I mentioned this because, like, if you watch like Rachel Maddow or the Sean Hannity show or whatever, you'll see that these commentators are always complaining about how the justice system is unequal. If you're, and of course it's unequal depending on your political views, right? If you're Rachel Maddow, you see the conservatives getting off and the liberals getting charges. And if you're Sean Hannity, right, you see the conservatives being charged and not the liberals, whatever. But the reality is that the prosecution, they can bring, to a certain extent, they can bring politics into play in making their decision whether to bring charges. Looking at and so this may explain the discrepancy in that you have like aggressive prosecutions of the January 6th insurrectionists, you know what I mean, including a whole bunch of people here in Central Florida who are being prosecuted for the January 6th insurrection, and a lot of the BLM, protests, and the people in Portland, Oregon, for example, burning down federal courthouses, basically getting time served or no charges at all, because of prosecutorial discretion. So it's just, it's a feature or a bug depending on your point of view. It's a feature in that the prosecution has sort of flexibility to look into the local circumstances. Maybe if I bring charges, I'm going to have more courthouses being burned down, so I'm not going to bring charges. Or it's a bug in that you do have unequal administration of justice. I do want to make one footnote. I don't have a slide on this, but I do. The previous state attorney for Orange County and Osceola County, Ayala, Aramis Ayala. I don't know if you know who she is, but she was the state attorney. She is the one who defeated Ashton Kutcher, the previous state attorney. And she had a policy that she wasn't going to bring any death penalty cases in Orange County or Osceola County. This became a huge showdown when there was a criminal suspect. His name is Markeith Lloyd. He was accused of shooting a police officer at the Walmart on Princeton Street, over there after College Park. And I got to tell you that there's facts are a little bit unclear. Markeith Lloyd has alleged that the police officer fired first at him, and because of what we know now, because of the Black Lives Matter movement, there's maybe some truth to that. Who knows? If it was self-defense or not. But the point is, he was charged for the murder of the police officer, but Aramis Ayala refused to bring death penalty charges, only a life imprisonment charge. Governor Scott when he was the governor, challenged this and went all the way up to the Florida Supreme Court. Aramis Ayala defended her decision based on prosecutorial discretion. But I will tell you, the Florida Supreme Court, in a very rare slapdown, the Florida Supreme Court said, no, this was an abuse of prosecutorial discretion, because although the prosecution does have discretion of when and if to bring charges and what charges to bring, it has to be administered on a case-by-case basis. You can't just have a blanket policy that you're never going to bring a death penalty case, no matter what, even if it's a police officer who's the victim. And the thing about it is that I find I understand the logic of the Florida Supreme Court. The thing about that I find a little bit controversial here is that when Aramis Ayala was running for office, she's an African-American woman, she made a point that was her campaign. That's how she won her election. And a part of the reason why she won the election, that she refused, as a matter of her own principle, to ever bring a death penalty charges, because historically death penalty is alleged that it's disproportionate effect on people of color, but that's a very interesting, very, very important case, because it does show that there is a limit to prosecutorial discretion. The prosecution has to exercise it on a case-by-case basis, not just a blanket policy for all of a given type of case. So that case was actually an important case that, even though it was decided in Florida, has national implications, because prosecutorial discretion is an important part of our system. All right, now what I want to do is do a time check and look at our survey results. And then if there's any time remaining, I'll talk about ethics. All right, quick time check here. Oh, we are at the end of the time. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to do here's what I'm going to do. If you want to bail, that's perfectly fine, because this class is scheduled to 2:50. If you're able to stay, I'll go ahead and share the results with you and talk about ethics till about 3:30. And so if you have to bail, I will perfectly understand. There's no problem there. So let's go ahead and do the screen share, and let me go into the website of the course, so I can share these results. So I think I'm going to go into assignments, and then I'm going to go into the survey. And this is important just because it's curiosity, right? Let's go ahead and survey statistics, and let's see what our tentative results are. Now, you get full credit for any response that you give, even though on Canvas it gives the green to the first response, but all the responses get credit. This is just a survey. I asked, what is the social media platform? This is out of my own personal curiosity. So we'll be talking a lot about Facebook and a lot about social media. If you think about it, the things that made Face Smash viral is why social media is viral today. The thing is that Face Smash was arguably an illegal website, whereas social media, if you redesign it and it can be perfectly legal. But here, out of curiosity, notice nobody uses Facebook. Nobody uses Facebook. But let me tell you, up until as late as 2018, Facebook was still what most people used. I've been doing this since I began teaching. And I got to tell you that Facebook would, at first would be like 90%. Then it would go down to 80%. Then by 2018 was the last time it got that narrow majority, like 50 or 51%. Now, of course, look at this. Most people are using Instagram in terms of the plurality. In reality, we're using all of these platforms, but this is just because you can only really respond to one at a time. Notice YouTube is also a very popular platform. You don't think of it maybe as a social media platform, but technically it is. You can see here that the idea, though, is that because Instagram is wholly owned by Facebook Inc., it's why the movie The Social Network is still a good movie to look at and talk about these issues. All right, so notice TikTok and Snapchat, if you combine them together, you've got like right there 39%, you know what I mean? So very popular websites indeed. And this is really interesting because this will be relevant to the last lecture when we ask, is Facebook an illegal monopoly? And what these results seem to show is that even though Facebook owns Instagram, look at all these other websites, look at all this competition, maybe Facebook is not an illegal monopoly as the government is alleging, but we'll do that in the very last unit on week 6. The next survey is, this is basically just to get student feedback. How would you describe this? And my main point here is to show you that we can do a taxonomy of any human behavior on 2 dimensions, legality and ethicality. And without getting into the distinction between ethics and morals, basically let's just lump that in, for our present purposes. Notice most people would say that it's just immoral, but not illegal, right? Actually, that was the second best answer. Most people thought it was illegal and immoral, and by a pretty wide margin. And then you have some of the more eccentric, but arguments can be made, based on the ELO chess ranking algorithm. I mean, my argument for the morality of Facebook is, Face Smash, is that Zuckerberg has a point. We judge people based on their looks all the time. You know what I mean? So why is it wrong all of a sudden when we do it via Face Smash? You know what I mean? This is actually a very touchy subject because, today is the anniversary of the death of George Floyd. And, if it weren't for the videos that were taken by private citizens, including young people that were, kids, teenagers, that probably would have gone. The police report makes it sound like he died of natural causes, not because of police misconduct. But let me tell you, right? But like, is it okay to take someone's picture in a public place? This is a very touchy subject. You know what I mean? A very touchy subject. Oh, I'm in a public place. That's not illegal. I can take your picture in a public place. But is that, should I be able to take your picture? Maybe if it's a police misconduct case where there's a compelling interest, yes, I can take the picture there or the video. But, without a compelling interest, that's why I say Face Smash is still relevant today. Finally, these last two little things here are just designed to show you the 2 big theories of ethics. One big theory is called consequentialism. Basically, the idea is that, you judge the morality. We all agree that it's wrong to kill somebody, right? That is non-negotiable. But if I do it to save 5 lives, maybe it's not wrong, And here, notice most students, look, 90%, 89% are saying that yes, I would pull, if I'm in an emergency situation, and we'll see next week what the common law, the law of necessity. Of course, then we can have what's called justified homicide, But then notice you have this scenario here. You have the same exact math, and now all of a sudden, the numbers are flipped. Over 80% are gonna. Now you have about 8% of the students who are consistent. They would push the guy over and pull the lever to save the 5 lives. But now all of a sudden, pushing someone over, that is crossing a moral line. This trolley problem is very, very famous because it's trying to, even though it's a completely made up scenario, completely hypothetical, right? Maybe not so hypothetical when you look at self-driving car technology, but generally it's hypothetical, right? It's kind of show that ethics is very difficult. So what I want to do here is completely optional. You're free to bail. But if you'll allow me to, I do want to do a lecture on the last part of this lecture. And I'll try to keep it short to about 20 minutes. I do want to talk about theories of ethics, what's often called natural law. Now, natural law is technically a misnomer because natural laws, we don't mean by that man-made law. Generally, we're talking about, historically speaking, with the church fathers, St. Thomas Aquinas says specifically, we're talking about laws given to us from God, In the modern contemporary setting, we're talking about human rights. So even if you're an atheist, you might still believe in natural rights or human rights. So it's a very powerful tradition. But natural law is just really a technical term for ethics, theories of morality. Even if something is legal, it might still be immoral. And that's why I do want to cover it here briefly, but I do want to introduce you because I think part of your college education, part of being a well-rounded, educated person in the liberal arts sense of the term education, a good, well-rounded, knowledge is knowing about the major theories of ethics and trying to distinguish between the 2 scenarios of the trolley problem. So what I'll do without further ado, just to end the lecture, is let's go ahead and talk about this. And here, I want to use a non-legal example. Well, actually, first of all, let me talk about a little bit about law to show you that the natural law tradition is actually a very deep tradition because it's enshrined in the Declaration of Independence. Now let's put to one side all the hypocrisy of slave owners signing the Declaration of Independence. You know what I mean? But if you look at the Declaration of Independence, just sort of, putting aside the historical anomaly of slavery, it's saying that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men, and of course today we would add women, are created equal, endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. And among these are the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's what we mean by natural law, that there's certain things that are right and wrong, not because the law says it is, but because that's just how it is, either because God says it or human rights or whatever, so it's a very important principle. And I will tell you, what I mean, Dr. King, always, in fact, the very famous, probably after the Declaration of Independence, perhaps the most famous document in American history is going to be the letter from a Birmingham jail. And where Dr. King cites natural law principles to explain why he's prepared to break the law, in order to protest unequal treatment, So, to me, this natural law stuff is really, really important, even if it's not law in the legal sense. That's what we mean here is law in the moral sense, in that. Okay, even if something is legal, should I still do it? Now, you hear this all the time. Artificial intelligence needs to be more ethical. Doctors and lawyers and accountants need to be more ethical. But I always say, I'm a professor, right? What's your theory of ethics? What do you mean by ethics? It turns out, and the trolley problem shows this beautifully, and this is what I want you to know as well-rounded college students, as part of your liberal arts education, your humanistic, general education, is that there's actually many more theories, but these are the big three. Remember when Miami had LeBron James and they had D Wade and Chris Bosh, the big three? This is the big three of natural law. Because the problem with natural law is we could all agree that we have these inalienable rights and that it's wrong to deprive people of their rights. But how do you decide? Because we all agree that it's okay to take life if it's an emergency situation. Sometimes we all agree that it's okay to punish people, and restrict their liberty if they break the law, right? Or do something maybe immoral. We all agree. What do we mean by happiness? How do we define? So there's now these three big theories that I do want you to know as well-rounded students, and good citizens. I want to, this can get complicated and get all technical, but I want to make it fun. And I want to give you an actual example from the world of politics that you may or may not remember. But I'm hoping that that you'll enjoy this presentation so I can illustrate how these three big theories work. Now, you can watch this film clip for yourself, but you may not remember, but back in August of 2015, all 20 candidates for the Republican presidential nomination signed something called the pledge. And the pledge was that if Donald Trump were to win the nomination, we're still going to support our party. We're still going to support our candidate. We're not going to run an independent third party and destabilize the election result. So fast forward now to March 3rd, 2016. This was the next to last debate presidential political primary. Now, on the Democratic side, it was just Hillary versus Bernie Sanders. There was no issue. There was no pledge, no issue there, But for the Republicans, it was a big issue because Donald Trump is such a controversial figure. And so if you look at this film clip, Brett Bauer, who was the moderator of the debate, says, "Gentlemen, back a year ago, or a few months ago, you made a pledge to, support the nominee, whoever it was. You know what I mean? Do you still stand behind your pledge?" Now, notice this is a great example of morality, not law, because clearly, as we'll see in the next class, this is not legally enforceable. I'll explain why in the next class under the common law of contracts. But morally speaking, when you make a promise, when you say you're going to do something and you don't do it, generally speaking, that's morally wrong. But why is it morally wrong? Well, it turns out there are these three big theories. But what I want to do is, and if you look at the film clip and do it on your own time, I don't want to get too political in here. I just want to use this as a fun example. I want to paraphrase the answers each of the candidates gave. You know what I mean? And first, Marco Rubio was the first guy to answer the question. And he basically, he had to think first, what am I going to say? Because if you recall, if you're into politics as I am, you're going to recall that Marco Rubio and Donald Trump around the same time had a big falling out, and Marco Rubio, I think Donald Trump said Marco Rubio had little hands, and Rubio complained that Donald Trump wears a lot of makeup, and it got really personal and nasty. So now Brett Bowers put Senator Rubio on the spot. And so Senator Rubio goes, yeah, you know what? Now that I think about it, I'm going to support Donald Trump, even if he's the nominee. And then he gives his answer. Why? Because Hillary Clinton Bernie Sanders is a socialist. He supports socialism policies. And Hillary Clinton, according to Senator Rubio, I'm just paraphrasing, she lied about Benghazi. What really happened during the Benghazi attack on the American consulate in Libya. And so, basically, that's a consequentialist type argument. You're basically saying, yeah, I'm going to keep my promise, my pledge to support Trump if he's the nominee, not because Trump is good, but because these other two candidates are bad or worse. You know what I mean? We don't want a socialist. We don't want a liar in office. So now the problem with consequentialism, it's a good theory. That explains why most of us are consequentialists when we're given the first scenario of the trolley problem, right? Because if I have to sacrifice one life to save five, what more, what can I do? I'm in a terrible situation, But the problem with consequentialism, and this is not to critique Marco Rubio, but this is just to make a general critique. Problem is that the trolley problem, it's fake, right? It's telling you it's 5 versus 1. In real life, it can be very hard to predict what the consequences of your actions are. go back to Marco Rubio's own example. Who knows? Maybe Bernie Sanders would have been the best president of all time. Who knows? Maybe Hillary Clinton would have been the best president of all time. So if you can persuade a consequentialist that actually, no, voting for Sanders or for Clinton is better than voting for Trump, then as a good consequentialist, you'd have to vote for the opposition, right? So that's kind of the problem with consequentialism, that it's results oriented. Again, it's a feature, but it's also a bug. It's a feature because it does seem to coincide with our intuition. Let's pick the best alternative. Let's pick the least bad alternative. But at the same time, it's a bug because, well, what is the least bad alternative? How do I know? And sometimes it's actually very hard to say, So now I want to do the second guy to speak. And the second guy to speak was actually Senator Ted Cruz, our friend from Cancun. And Ted Cruz says, his answer, actually, I loved his answer. He goes, down here in Texas, when you give your word, you got to be a man of your word. You got to keep your word. And by the way, one of the reasons why I love that argument is because in business, you see that a lot, the gentleman's agreement, or you give your word a handshake and you have to honor it at all costs, It's your reputation on the line. And I kind of associate that with virtue ethics, the second big theory of morality. Virtue ethics, what's different, with consequentialism, you look at the results of your actions, if you can figure out what those results are. With virtue ethics, you look at the moral character of the person acting. Is that a good or bad person? Now, one problem with virtue, so the idea with Aristotle is a virtue ethics, a virtuous person, someone who keeps their promises, for example, they keep their word. A virtuous person, someone who doesn't lie, those kind of things. So it's a very powerful theory going all the way back to Aristotle, because it kind of coincides with a lot of our moral intuitions about what a virtuous person is or is not. Problem with virtue ethics, though, and I don't mean to be, I don't mean to be that guy, but as the professor, I always have to show you both sides of the story. The problem with virtue ethics is, what do you do with the trolley problem? What does a virtuous man or virtuous woman do when confronted with the various scenarios of the trolley problem? You know what I mean? The problem with virtue ethics from a logical perspective is that it's circular. That, okay, a moral person is someone who has virtue. Someone who has virtue, someone who acts morally. Well, how do I break that cycle? Nonetheless, I think it's a very powerful. I think Senator Cruz was onto something when he said, I'm a man of my word, so I have to. Even though I don't like Trump, and you may recall, it got very nasty between Trump and Senator Cruz later on, because Trump had retweeted back when he was on Twitter before he got kicked off. He had retweeted a very unflattering picture of Senator Cruz's wife, and so Senator Cruz, like a good husband, took offense at that, and so that got really, really, really ugly as well. Finally, the last guy to answer the question was Governor Kasich of Ohio. You're probably going, who? And Kasich, though, to me, he gave a really cool answer. He said, he basically made a reference to Teddy Roosevelt, the president from 1901 to 1909. And Teddy Roosevelt famously said that, he gave the speech called "The Man in the Arena." Today we'd say the woman in the arena. Teddy Roosevelt is a great speech because saying, look, before you criticize me and my policies, why don't you try to do what I'm trying to do? Why don't you run for office? Why don't you put it all on the line? Or like LeBron James says, put it all on the floor. Why don't you try to make the world a better place? You know what I mean? Then you can criticize me for what I'm doing or not doing. And so Governor Kasich says, you know what? I'm in the arena, so I gotta respect Trump. I don't like him, but I gotta respect him. We're away from our families. We're all over the country. So yeah, I'm gonna, Kasich says, I'm gonna go ahead and keep my promise that I'm gonna, if Trump is the nominee, I'm gonna have to go ahead and keep my word. And this is a very Kantian, or the fancy term is deontological. It is a fancy word for duty ethics. What is your moral duty? And duty ethics is really interesting. It's kind of like a combination of consequentialism and virtue ethics, right? Duty ethics is a way of trying to describe what is a virtuous man or a virtuous woman, virtuous person, right? Someone who keeps their duties, doesn't breach their duties. Also, probably keeping your duties, probably overall has good consequences. But even if it has bad consequences, you have to keep your duty, And so this is associated with this guy called Immanuel Kant, this Prussian or German philosopher back in the late 1700s. And he famously said in German that it's called the categorical imperative. You decide what's moral, not just by consequences or virtue, but by following a universal law that you would want everybody else to follow. In a way, what Immanuel Kant does is he takes the golden rule from religion and from the Bible, and he universalizes it. Says, look, you have to follow the golden rule. You have to do unto others as you want them to do unto you. Basically, is the common sense version of this sophisticated Kantian theory. That you have a duty to comply with the universal law, to do what you want other people to do. If you don't want other people to lie and break their promises, you can't lie and break your promises. Now, I will tell you, in fairness, philosophers have come up with any number of critiques of the duty ethics and Kantian ethics, the famous example that's always given, the one that always has struck me as the most powerful example, is what happens when your duties collide. So this is the example of and if you've never read The Diary of Anne Frank, that's one of the most important books I think you can ever read, after the Bible and other religious, books, because it shows you, how terrible sometimes the world is. And what also shows you how great sometimes, the family that hid Anne Frank and her family, they risked their own life, to protect Anne Frank's family and Anne Frank. And what's interesting is that that was in Amsterdam. And by the way, if you ever get to go to Amsterdam, Holland, the Netherlands, that's a must visit. The Anne Frank house, where it was she was hiding, during the occupation when the Germans took over. But what's happening is the Germans knew that a lot of people were hiding, people from Jewish faith and gypsies and other people that the Nazis were rounding up. And so they would be knocking on people's door. They'd be doing their investigations. They would check the trash. They would check. There was something called the Waffen SS, and they were basically the secret police. And they would be doing their investigations. Oh, look at this house. There's a lot of trash coming out of that house. Maybe they're hiding people from the authorities. So they would knock on your door. And this is the problem with Kantian ethics. If the Waffen SS, you're hiding Anne Frank, and the Waffen SS officer knocks on your door and says, "Tell me, why are you hiding? Why are you hiding enemies of the state?" Kant would say, well, you have a duty to tell the truth, even under this situation, which clearly that conflicts with our moral intuition. No, I'm going to lie. I'm going to protect the life of Anne Frank and her family. So what do you do when you have duties colliding? How do you decide which duty, it takes precedence over the other duty? I would say the duty of life takes precedence over the duty of truth. But, can we come up with a more general rule whenever duties collide? So long story short is that all of these, there's just three different ways of looking at ethics. You know what I mean? Three different ways of natural law, of defining what it is that's right and wrong. I wanted to share with you all three because personally, I think all three have something to teach us in that, sometimes virtue is important. Sometimes the consequences are important. And sometimes, duties are important. I do want to give you a postscript. I don't want to leave you hanging. What was ironic about the whole thing with Trump and the pledge is that it turned out that all three of Trump's opponents, the last three guys to be in the race, all three waffled till the very end. Senator Rubio, he was the first to finally in June, he bit the bullet and said, June 2016, you know what? Yeah, okay. I'll have to endorse Trump. You know what I mean? And I think, if you're not mistaken, Rubio was running for re-election that year. So probably that explains what was going on there. With Senator Cruz, it actually took him until I think the end of October. Fine, the whole thing with the spat about his wife, it took him, till the very last week of the election cycle to basically say, yeah, you know what, I'm going to bite the bullet. I did make a promise, so I better, keep my word, but it didn't take him out. And Governor Kasich, who was the Kantian, when I was blogging about this at the time, back in March of 2016, I predicted erroneously, I even bet $100 to one of my colleagues that Kasich would be the one to keep his word because he was a Kantian. And Kantian duties are based on human dignity and human respect. and those are always non-negotiable. Well, the irony is that Governor Kasich, he broke his word. He not only did he not keep his pledge to support the nominee, he actually ended up endorsing the candidate, other major political parties' candidate. So it was I was totally wrong on that one, and it shows you the limits of your theories of ethics. How do they guide our actions? But nonetheless, I want to share with you those theories because I think it is important to know what these theories are in deciding for ourselves what's right and what's wrong. At the very least, the next time somebody says X group of people or X has to be more ethical, you should always respond, what is your theory of ethics? How do you define what is ethical? How do you define what's right and wrong? And it turns out there are a lot of different ways of looking at it. I will end on this note. The trolley problem, right, does show you that a lot of times we are consequentialists, right? We look at the consequences. If we can figure out what the consequences are, we do the weigh, we weigh the cost and benefits, and we just pick that choice that has most benefits and fewest costs. But even consequentialism has a limit, as our survey results showed with the second scenario, trolley problem scenario, that for a lot of us, this might be crossing a line where, we're not allowed to look at the consequences, because here it's just outright murder, where you murder someone in order to save the 5 lives, as opposed to pressing a lever. Moral philosophers draw the distinction between killing and letting die. And, when we look at the common law, we'll look at the law of necessity, and the law as a whole. That's what's so great about the common law tradition. But we'll look at that in our next class. All right, with that, I'm going to end the screen share here and end the class. I always like to end with questions, comments, concerns, or suggestions, and then we'll wrap it up there. Of course, everyone's free to bail. We're certainly well over the time. I apologize for that. Part of the problem there is that we have to compress, 5, we have 5 basically classes left, including this one. We have to compress a lot of information. For purposes of the quiz, what you just need to know is that virtue ethics focuses on a person's moral character, and consequentialist ethics focuses on the outcomes of your actions, and deontological ethics or Kantian ethics focuses on what are your moral duties, and these duties are universal and categorical, designed to vindicate human dignity and respect for others. It's the golden rule, basically, in a secular fashion. Any questions, comments, or concerns?
I have a quick question, Professor. The movie The Social Network, is it regarding the discussion posts due this Friday?
So the discussion post is exactly what this class is about.
Mhm.
Is Facebook illegal? Yes or no, in your opinion? Is Facebook immoral? Yes or no, in your opinion? So yeah, the Social Network, by the way, the face smash scene is the first 20 minutes of the movie after Jesse Eisenberg breaks up with, Erica Albright. Right now I'm blanking out, but that's a famous, Dakota Fanning, a famous actress. She was, I think, in 50 Shades of Grey, other movies, etc. So after that breakup scene, which is a great, I find that opening scene in The Social Network to be riveting, Then Zuckerberg, because of the breakup with the girlfriend, then he's kind of like upset at the world. And so he's going to take out his revenge, and he's going to build Face Smash. And in Mr. Zuckerberg's actual blog posts, he does mention, her name is not Erica Albright. And, he does mention, but that's been redacted. We don't know for her privacy reasons. But the fact that her name was redacted shows that we'll see this in the next class. It's possible that Zuckerberg committed the tort of invasion of privacy, which is a civil wrong. It's not necessarily a criminal wrong unless you use a computer without authorization, but we'll look at civil wrongs in the next class. But yeah, Social Network is the first part is about Face Smash. And personally, that's my favorite part of the movie. And I would add, I think it's the most historically accurate part of the movie in that it's mostly based on Zuckerberg's own blog posts. If you read the article in the Harvard Crimson, you'll see what he said in those blog posts, and you can compare the monologue in the movie, and you'll see that there's a big overlap.
Thank you.
Yeah. So you just want your opinion for the discussion post. The main thing there, just get it done on time and get the word count. Clearly, there's no right answer. There's no right answer. I think you can make a strong case that no, Zuckerberg did not break the law because, we saw the state law. It has to be a monetary sort of intent there to defraud. with federal law without authorization. There's a gray area there. Zuckerberg is a Harvard student. So to some extent, I mean, how come, if anybody has authorization, I mean, if I have authorization to look at the student ID photos in real life, why wouldn't I have authorization to download them? Especially it's like an image scrape, as we would call it, in today's terminology, like, is it illegal for me to image scrape, as long as I leave the image up there for others to cut and paste from the internet? I may be committing copyright infringement. We'll talk about that in week 4 when we look at the law of ideas. Copyright infringement, that's a whole other kettle of fish, or as they say in Puerto Rico, it's a whole other $20. But is it really hacking? Is it using a computer without authorization? If I download a photo without, but I still leave the photo up there for others to use. So a case could be made that, so that's why it's completely your opinion, completely your, and that's why the Van Buren case, by the way, is so important, because that will help decide, how broadly the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act should be interpreted. And same thing with the moral aspect of it. You have now 3 theories to judge the morality of face mash, whether it's a virtuous thing, whether it's consistent with moral duties, it'd be interesting to know. I don't know for a fact, was Zuckerberg, the face mash. Actually, the movie does get one thing wrong. Face mash was just not about girls, quote unquote. Face mash technically actually had pictures of guys on there as well. But the algorithm, the way it worked is you had to get 2 pictures of 2 girls or pictures of 2 guys. And then you would just rank, you would rank them. So the movie sensationalizes a little bit by making it sound like it was just only girls that were being ranked or co-eds that were being ranked. But in fact, both boys and girls, guys and gals were being ranked, And so the question is that, arguably, if Zuckerberg's own picture was part of the face mash, database, then you could argue that he's treating others the way he's treating himself. He's willing to be judged. So, he's complies with his minimal Kantian duties, or you could argue that, no, this is a gross affront because you are explicitly ranking people, you know what I mean? And that is, it's one thing for you to rank somebody personally in your mind. It's quite another thing to create an algorithm that actually generates a searchable result, of who is the hottest person. And so, so that can be looked at both pro and con. By the way, let me ask Ben and I don't know if Antonella's in the house. If there's any chat questions to be moderated.
There were just a couple of questions about the peer review, but I think those are pretty much answered.
Yeah, great. So peer review, I didn't do it for this assignment, but only did it for the introductory assignment. Basically, just review, respond 1 sentence or less to 3 fellow classmates, just so you get to know who they are in the class. You know what I mean? That's all that's about. A very simple thing. We don't really grade that. We just see if it's done. So that's all to be done there. Any other questions, comments, or concerns? As you can see, this stuff is very fascinating. Yeah, go ahead.
So the peer reviews. So we need to in this new discussion, we need to respond to three different people.
No, just on the last week's. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
I think going forward to keep it simple, this is just an opinion. You know what I'm saying? So I'm not going to require any more peer reviews. You know what I mean? Yeah. So that was just for the first academic activity. It's just since those were introductions. You know what I mean? So that'll be the only time that we'll be doing the peer reviews, just to keep it simple.
Thank you.
As you can see, this hacking is really, really fascinating. It is an important problem. We haven't even begun to consider secondary liability. You know what I'm saying? This is the Cambridge Analytica problem. Even if Facebook was not the one using people's data to manipulate, their ads, so they would vote a certain way, but Facebook allowed it to happen. Could they be legally liable? So the common law actually has answers to all of those problems and civil wrongs generally. And so next week, this will be a preview. We'll see that the common law consists of 3 broad areas of law: property rights, private property, contracts, which allow you to transfer your property rights and make deals and exchanges, and finally torts, or so-called civil wrongs, including the tort of invasion of privacy. including there's other torts as well. So next week, what we'll do is, if this week we focused on the criminal side of face smash, you know what I mean, and looked at the potential legal liability that Zuckerberg could have faced under state, federal, and international law. Next week, what we'll do is we'll look at it from the civil side, you know, and look at the potential civil liability that Zuckerberg might have faced. And when we talk about business law, you know, outside of the domain of hacking, we really are talking mostly about civil liability. When is a company financially responsible for wrongs that it might commit? You know, breach of contract, for example, you know, torts where its users or consumers get injured, you know, and property rights, you know, when property rights are infringed. So we'll do all of that next week, again, big picture stuff, just so you have the basic schema of the seamless web, but you'll have a good introduction to the common law. And for those of you who want to go into law school, I'll say this, that your first year of law school is entirely the common law. You'll be taking a class in torts, you'll be taking a class in contracts, you'll be taking a class in property, and most likely you'll be taking a class in civil procedure, which I'll talk about that in week 5, when we look at civil and criminal cases. But for that, then let's go ahead and call it a day. I do apologize for extending. I'll try to keep the other lectures well within the, you know, so we can end at 2:50 and then just do an office hour after that. I'll stay on just a little bit longer in case anybody does have a question or comment or concern. Otherwise, you know, definitely free to leave at this point. While you're here, since, by the way, since most of you are, a lot of you are still on here, I will say that for the quiz, you know, take a look at chapter 1. That's going to be the main thing there. The main thing there that I didn't talk about is, I will say there's some other, they're not sources of law per se, but they summarize what the law is, something called the Restatement and Black's Law Dictionary. And there's something called stare decisis, which we'll look at in more detail next week. So stare decisis is really the principle that like cases have to be decided the same way. It's probably one of the most important ideas of the common law. And so the idea, if you think about it, Congress, when they enact a law, they can do whatever the hell they want, you know? The state government, when they enact a law, they can do whatever the heck they want. International treaties, you know, it's whatever the parties can agree to, you know? But when it comes to courts, when courts are deciding cases, they have to decide current cases the way old cases have been decided. Now, a case like Van Buren versus the United States, which is a case of first impression, that's why that case is taking so long to decide, because there the court's going to establish a rule that all the other lower courts, including the Supreme Court itself, will have to follow in the future. So that's what I mean by stare decisis. The Restatement and Black's Law Dictionary, these are just basically private compendiums that summarize law. These are things that students will use in law school to understand what the law is, you know. Sometimes it's just easier to look at the Restatement of Law. It's published by the American Law Institute, which is a private organization. But it's a great honor when you're invited as a law professor to join the ALI, because it's such a you know, influential organization. Judges use the Restatement all the time in trying to figure out what the law is. But we'll see that these are just private summaries of the law. Black's Law Dictionary has a bunch of you know, what legal concepts mean, you know what I mean? But technically, when we talk about law, you know, putting natural law and morality to one side, that's a very controversial topic, the relationship between law and morality. But law, we just mean state law, you know, which includes local law. And we mean federal law enacted by the Congress or a presidential executive order. And finally, we also international law, which are these voluntary treaties that some countries have, you know, ratified and have joined voluntarily, but not all countries, you know. So that each treaty, you know, will have a different set of member states, you know, and the international law will fluctuate depending on which states have joined which treaties. So there's really no such thing as a single overarching international law. It just depends on what treaties are out there and how have they been, you know, whether they've been ratified or not and by which countries. Finally, there is natural law. I myself do consider myself a natural lawyer, so I'm a big proponent of the natural law. But even myself, you know, I understand that, you know, the controversy with natural law is defining its content. but what are these rights that we have? What do we mean by life, liberty, and happiness? And when are we authorized to just deprive people of these rights? And there, to be perfectly honest and fair, you have three big theories of morality for determining what's right and what's wrong. Consequentialism, Kantian duties, golden rule, and virtue ethics, persons of good moral character. And all three are attractive in different settings and, have certain intuitive appeal. So I just want to throw that out there. So now you have a big, well-rounded picture after today's class of the legal system. These three, think of that spider's web, right? In the center is state law, because the states existed before the federal government existed. Then what I call the expanding web, right? Federal law, right? All these new laws being enacted, every day. And then finally, the outer edges of the spider web is the international law, right? That may or may not apply depending on whether that country, the United States, has ratified the treaty or not. So that gives you just a big picture of the legal system. Always in the background, again, it's controversial what the relationship is between morality and law, but always in the background are theories of morality and theories of ethics informing, what we think is right and wrong, even when something is legal, if I will wish everybody then a great week and see everybody next Tuesday. Take care. God bless. Charge on. Now, if there's any last minute question, concern, comment, I'll stay on a little longer. Don't want to cut anybody off short, but I do want to just impress on the magnitude of what we've covered today. Pretty basic, pretty simple when you look at it from a big perspective, but really important. Laws, these three overlapping areas: state, federal, and international, and they can regulate the very same conduct. That's what cybercrime, the example we saw today. And then always in the background is, even if something is legal, even if it's not hacking in the legal sense, there might still be some moral implications involved. So you actually, I think after today's class, believe it or not, I think we've accomplished a lot. We have a big picture of the seamless web of the three levels of law, and we have now a big picture of the various theories of right and wrong, good and bad, ethics, morality. All right, great. Let me go into the comments here just to make sure. It's okay, everyone, just wishing everybody a goodbye. Ms. Vatili will be responding to specific questions there that I'm not following the thread. But great, this has been a great class. Again, I'm sorry for going over. I'll be more conscientious, way more the next time, and make sure we end on time. This is part of making up for last week where, we didn't really do much, and it was worth it, believe me, because now you have a big picture. All right, great. So hopefully everybody's concern is answered. Let's see, Fernanda has a question there. You can always, jump in there because I'm missing the thread here. But yeah, you'll be doing one discussion post. We've all done the survey now, one discussion post and one quiz. Now, don't freak out too much about it, but this is just to give people an incentive to read chapter 1, have a basic background of legal foundations. And this lecture should help too. I will end the recording, by the way.
Professor, hi, I have one question.
Yes, jump in here.
You did say that there's no peer reviews for